Toxic parents who kicked me out at 18 and cut me off showed up at my son's birthday party to beg for money. Later, they tried to take me to court for $50,000 I never stole. Hey everyone. So, I'm a 28-year-old man who celebrated my son's third birthday 3 days ago. Most of the guests were our coworkers with kids and a few of my son's friends from daycare along with their parents. I had also invited my estranged parents after they contacted me 2 weeks ago, saying they wanted to make amends. Here's some backstory to explain why I don't get along with them. My parents kicked me out 10 years ago, just a few months before I was supposed to start college. To make it extra special, they kicked me out on my 18th birthday. My parents were never very loving or caring. I felt ignored and unwanted throughout my childhood. The only reason they didn't kick me out before I turned 18 was probably that it would have been illegal. But as soon as they legally could, they did, and I wasn't even surprised. What did surprise me was that they did it on my birthday, just a few months before I was supposed to start college. I tried to convince my parents to let me stay with them until I graduated and to cover my tuition, but they were firm in their decision. They wanted me out so they could start their own business and travel around the country in an RV. I understood their dreams, but not at the expense of my future. I used every tactic I could think of to change their minds, even resorting to crying, but nothing worked. They gave me 1 month to move out and find a way to support myself. I had been working as a cashier at a local mall, saving up to buy a car. After my parents' ultimatum, I decided to leave and use that money. I didn't have much, but I was extremely upset with my parents. I never liked them much, but after my birthday, I hated them. Over the next 2 days, I texted all my relatives to see if they could help me. Most of them turned their backs on me, which wasn't surprising and was part of the reason I never spoke out against my parents before. I had no one to count on. My friends were nice, but they had their own lives and couldn't let me live with them. I'm lucky that one of my distant relatives, my mother's cousin Uncle Kevin, responded to my email and said I could live with him as long as I helped out around the house. I just needed somewhere to go, so I packed my bags and traveled to Utah to live with Uncle Kevin. I didn't tell my parents anything, and they didn't ask. I didn't even say goodbye before I left, and I doubt they cared. Uncle Kevin was a nice guy and made me help out with various things around the house, but it was nothing too difficult. He also ran a popular diner, and he told me I could work there as a cashier for the time being. If I was diligent and sincere, he said he would pay for my tuition. Uncle Kevin was a bit eccentric, but he was well off from his grandparents' inheritance, and since he had no family of his own, he could afford to help me out. By working hard and honestly at the diner, I showed my uncle how serious I was, and that's how I paid for college. After I graduated and moved out, I offered to start paying Uncle Kevin back, but he told me not to bother. He joked that he'd collect his dues when I became a bigger success story. He was weird but sweet. Unfortunately, he never got the chance to collect as he passed away from a stroke a few years after I left. It was sudden, and by the time his housekeeper got him to the hospital, it was too late. I'm incredibly grateful for everything Uncle Kevin did for me. I'll always cherish that he was able to attend my wedding and stand in for my parents. Uncle Kevin never got along with his family, including my mother, so my parents never found out where I lived or who paid for my tuition. Or maybe they did find out but didn't bother to contact me. Either way, I didn't hear from my parents at all after I left, until a few weeks ago. They told me they found me on social media through a cousin who helped them track me down. They had heard that I was now married and had a 3-year-old son. They'd apologized in their message for what they did all those years ago and said they wanted to make things right and meet my wife and son. It felt half-hearted, and I almost didn't reply. But then they sent another message the next day, saying they really wanted to meet their grandson while they were still around. It was clear they were trying to emotionally manipulate me. Despite this, I agreed and told them to come over on my son's birthday. I didn't have any particular plan, but after talking to my wife about the messages, she said she didn't mind having them over if I was okay with it. She knows all the history with them, and we've been married for 5 years. It's been 10 years since my parents kicked me out, so she told me that if I thought it was water under the bridge, I could invite them. Her own parents had passed away when she was young, and she was raised by her grandparents, who also passed away in the last few years. I could tell that she really wanted some family at the party. I didn't care much about reconciliation, but I felt like my wife actually did want them there and wasn't saying it because she didn't want to pressure me. So I invited my parents for my wife's sake. On the day of the party, they arrived an hour early before all the other guests so we could have some one-on-one time. It was awkward and uncomfortable, but we tried to make small talk after I introduced them to my wife and son. They were polite and respectful for the most part, but then my wife went into the kitchen to make my dad some tea, and that's when my mother told me they were there to discuss something else too and didn't want to say it in front of my wife, so they had asked her for tea. With just the 3 of us, my parents apologized again, saying they had realized they treated me badly during my childhood and wanted to make amends now that they had done everything they wanted to do. I thought it was nice of them to apologize and that they were finally acting like decent people. But before I could accept their apology, they told me they needed money. That was a major reason they were there. Apparently, they had blown through their savings while traveling and were struggling to pay their bills. They wanted my help to live. They knew my wife and I were relatively well off. She's a real estate agent, and I work at a bank, so we were comfortable and could afford to help them. I was really annoyed because it felt like my parents' apology wasn't genuine. It seemed like they were just trying to get money from me. They even used their grandson to try and make me feel sorry for them. And while it didn't work on me, my wife fell for it. I understood why she did because she missed her family and wanted us to repair our relationship. However, I regretted inviting them over. I didn't say anything then because my wife came in with drinks and looked happy. My mother asked me to think about helping them out. My wife asked what we talked about, but I said we'd talk later because I didn't want to argue with my parents. Just as the guests were starting to arrive, my wife chatted with my parents for a few minutes. She seemed to enjoy their company, but I kept quiet because I wanted them to leave before I got upset. Luckily, the first guests arrived right on time, so I focused on the party. I stayed busy with my son and the party activities until it was time for him to cut the cake, which went smoothly. Everyone had a good time. After that, I was going to the kitchen with my wife when my parents stopped me again to ask if I had made a decision. I got frustrated and told them to wait in the living room with everyone else, and I would talk to them soon. Once everyone had cake, I gathered everyone in the living room and gave a speech. I introduced my parents to the guests, and they seemed happy about it. However, their smiles disappeared when I started talking about my childhood and how they kicked me out and I had to live with my uncle. I lightened the mood with jokes and everyone laughed a bit, except my parents who looked embarrassed. My wife kept a neutral expression. I talked about how my parents and I didn't talk for 10 years after they kicked me out. Then I mentioned how they recently contacted me to meet their grandson, and I almost ignored them but decided against it because I was glad they weren't asking for money like some nightmare parents might. I made it sound like a comedy routine, and then I joined the guests while my parents awkwardly chuckled along. It didn't spoil the birthday fun. As the party wound down, guests started leaving, and my parents left quickly, shooting me angry looks but not saying anything. I was relieved because I didn't want to argue with them right outside the house. After the guests left and we put our son to bed, I tried to explain things to my wife. However, she immediately criticized me for my speech, calling it unnecessary and stupid. She insisted I apologize to the guests and my parents for embarrassing them. I interrupted her to tell her why my parents had really come, but she didn't care. She accused me of ruining our son's birthday and making it about myself with the speech. I felt this was unfair because our son was just 3 and wouldn't remember this later. The guests actually found it funny, but my wife disagreed, saying it was not the right time for such talk. I felt it was necessary to express my disappointment with my parents. However, my wife insisted I apologize to everyone for my behavior. I was really stressed that day because of my parents and how my wife was upset about something that didn't bother anyone else. But I felt like she wasn't considering my feelings about the situation even after hearing why my parents came over. So I got upset with her too and said I only invited my parents because she wanted me to. I thought she should understand my side, but she was focused on her own feelings, and I called her self-involved. She started crying when I got upset, and I felt bad about it. I tried to comfort her, but she pushed me away and said I was being self-involved and hypocritical. She said she wouldn't talk to me until I apologized to everyone at the party. She even moved her things to the guest bedroom and has been sleeping there since. We haven't talked since that night because I haven't apologized to the guests yet. I don't think what I did was wrong, and I feel like my wife is overreacting. I still haven't heard anything from my parents, and no one at the party has mentioned my speech either. I think my wife has blown things out of proportion and believes people will judge us, but that's not true. However, I can't explain this to her because she won't talk to me. I also feel like she's not trying to see my side. I already put my parents aside once for her and to keep peace before the party, but I couldn't do it again because they were too much, and it's probably true that my wife wanted my parents at the party more than I did. She didn't deny it when we argued that night. My wife acts like I ruined the party, but no one cares as much as she does. I don't want to apologize because I don't think I did anything wrong. My parents kicked me out at 18 and ignored me for 10 years, so I think it was fair to call them out at the party after they kept asking for money. I tried to handle things calmly, but I got emotional when my parents pushed too hard. My wife needs to understand that. I think I can apologize to my wife for calling her self-involved. That wasn't nice. But I don't feel like I owe apologies beyond that. Maybe I'll consider saying sorry to the guests, but definitely not to my parents. Update 1. I talked to my wife today. The comments on my original post were split on what I should do, so I thought, why not just talk to my wife? After 6 days of not speaking and sleeping separately since the party, I realized we need to communicate for our marriage to work. We tried to keep it quiet for our son's sake, but he's too young to notice, so there's no excuse for us not to talk. Today, before we left for work, I stopped my wife and insisted we needed to talk. Thankfully, she didn't ignore me, and our son was in the other room having breakfast, so we could talk calmly. I apologized to her for calling herself involved, but I didn't see any other reason to apologize. I didn't ruin the party like she thought, and no one has even mentioned the speech to me yet, not even my parents. I gently told her that I felt she had overreacted a bit, and then I waited for her response. She agreed, saying that after a few days, once her anger had cooled off, she realized she had acted selfishly and hadn't considered my feelings. She also admitted that she had indirectly influenced me to invite my parents to reconcile, even though she hadn't explicitly said it. While we discussed the idea, she had been subtly trying to sway me because she genuinely wanted a happy family for us. So it turns out I wasn't wrong about that, and she apologized to me for it. Her reasons make sense emotionally because all she really wanted was for us to have a complete family, something she hadn't experienced as a child. She hoped that as a married woman she could have some semblance of it. However, with our strained relationship with my parents, there was little chance our son could experience the love and affection from grandparents that she had been fortunate to have. She didn't receive the love she deserved from her parents because they passed away when she was young. Now she worries that her son won't have grandparents to love him. This is important to her because she was raised by her grandparents after her parents died, so having grandparents around means a lot. Her desire for a complete family triggered her reaction the other day, and she acknowledged this. I also apologized for not discussing these feelings with her and for our lack of communication, which contributed to the situation. So in short, we talked things out and decided that therapy would be necessary to address these issues. We already attend individual therapy, but now we'll also consider couples counseling for some other unrelated matters. Thanks to everyone for their comments and support. I didn't think I'd be back so soon with an update, but here I am, thanks to my parents. They sent me a lawsuit saying I stole $50,000 from them before I left 10 years ago, and now they want it back since they found me. None of this is true, and I feel sorry for whoever agreed to be their lawyer. They must be really desperate for money. I won't entertain this nonsense and have already contacted my lawyer. My wife takes back what she said about me needing to apologize to my parents. Now she sees what kind of people they are. They might think they can get away with this because I was nice to them when they first came by, but that was just for my son's birthday. I'm not worried about the consequences, so I'm sharing this online to let everyone know what they're up to now and what they did to me in the past. I shared everything on my Facebook profile, every single detail I've talked about here. It's been 20 minutes and I haven't gotten any texts or calls yet. But I'm waiting because I know people will be upset, especially since I mentioned how my family didn't support me when I needed it, but now that I'm doing better, they act friendly. I've never invited anyone to events, but relatives who ignored me before now try to be friendly, which feels fake. Now they have their own kids to think about, and having a relative who works in a bank and can help them get jobs is convenient for them. I know things will happen soon. I'm just waiting for it. Hey everyone, I'm back after about 3 days. My parents freaked out after I posted and called me multiple times to take it down. I didn't listen until they promised in a text to drop their case. I needed that in writing and now I have it. After that, they blocked me. Things got ugly with my relatives. I named them in my post, and they left nasty comments about me, my wife, and even my son. It just proves my point about them being awful and selfish. Surprisingly, their kids apologized for their parents' behavior, which was backward but nice to see. I've removed the post now, but a lot of people saw it. Those who turned their backs on me got what they deserved, and I'm glad. In short, my parents dropped their case. I made up with my relatives, and my wife and I are still strong. Thanks for the support, Reddit, but I'm taking a break now. Signing off.